Thank you for your time. So if you don't know who we are, just very briefly, the Centre for Cities is a research organisation that looks at how cities contribute to our national economy. And Glasgow is a crucial part of the Scottish economy. There we are. So we know that Glasgow contributes to 20% of Scotland's economy. We also know it's Scotland's largest urban area. But what we don't talk about as much is how much it contributes to Scotland's lost potential. So we estimate Scotland's lost potential, economic potential that is, as about £10 billion every year. Glasgow contributes to 7 billion of that £10 billion every year. And you can see that in your chart in the report on page 12, but you can also see it here. You can see there we've got Glasgow, Dundee in the small urban rural areas. Dundee contributes about 500 million of that lost output gap, and the smaller urban and rural areas contribute to the remaining 2.3 billion. And we're not including Edinburgh and Aberdeen in those smaller urban areas. We're not trying to avoid any local rivalries either. But basically, Edinburgh and Aberdeen both perform as we would expect for cities of their size. And I think it only strengthens the argument that an investment in Glasgow is actually an investment in Scotland and a more prosperous UK as an extension of that. But what role does public transport play in this? And you can see this chart in page 7 of your report. But actually, Glasgow performs pretty well in terms of public transport network size when compared to other British cities. If we look there, we can see that it's actually larger than Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, and Sheffield. It doesn't perform at the same size as Birmingham and London, but there should be no surprise. They're cities of a larger geographical footprint. And also, we shouldn't be surprised that Glasgow has a large footprint. It has a subway system, and it also has a large heavy rail system. And those are key assets that let Glasgow stand out compared to many of its British counterparts. However, Glasgow, like many other UK cities, doesn't perform as well compared to European cities. And this chart is just below the last chart on page 7. And what you can see here is that actually of the 44 cities that have been analysed across Western Europe, only 6 of them have a network size that is smaller than Glasgow. And for some of these cities, that's actually not too much of a problem. We know that European cities, when you're on holiday walking down nice boulevards and avenues, that they're a lot denser. So if we look at somewhere like Turin or Seville, that they're actually a lot more dense. So it means that even though they have a smaller network size, it means that they can connect more people. But when we look at cities such as Munich, we can see that actually they have a much larger network size, and they're also able to move a lot more people. And this is important because when we're talking about cities, we need to be focused on that actually we need to be looking at their labour markets. And if we can move more people into Glasgow, connecting residents of Glasgow with economic opportunities across Glasgow, then it doesn't just make it beneficial for them, but it also makes it beneficial for the wider economy. So what these first few slides have shown is that while Glasgow can celebrate that it's better than other British cities, that actually Glasgow and other UK cities don't compete very well with European peers. So when we looked at this report, what we were looking at is actually how do we improve the transport network? And there's always a lot of flashy news around rail and tram, and buses might be considered the ugly cousin of these projects, but actually most public transport users in Glasgow and in Scotland use bus networks. And what we should be really looking at is that if we want to make relatively quick gains, not building huge infrastructure projects, that we can actually looking at the bus network and how we improve that. And this graphic is on page 14, if you're struggling to see it. But basically how we've looked at this is that, okay, we've got 2 major ways that we can improve our bus network. We can look at our existing routes, but we can also look at setting new routes. And that's basically the methodology the report looks at. And we say, okay, if we're looking at existing routes, how can we improve them? So we've looked at increasing frequencies. So those services that do currently run, if they were to run quicker, how many of those residents could we make better connected? But we've also said, okay, because Glasgow has this unique assets in terms of its heavy rail infrastructure, but also its subway, if we made the buses complementary to the rail system and integrate them, then how many more residents could we connect? And I think it's important that we stress that is that with a greater labour market, we can make the Glasgow more prosperous. And again, as we've outlined at the start, Scotland more prosperous. So this map here is on page 17 of your report. Just in case it's a bit smaller for anyone, and I'm a map nerd, so I always love looking at these things. But we can see that actually its coverage is good. I mean, it's compared to the UK cities, its coverage is good. It extends beyond the city authority, and we can connect some residents outside. However, when we start comparing it, as we say again, to the European peers, that we're not getting there. So this area where we see that splodge in the middle and some of those islands connected on the outside, this covers about 900,000 people, just under 900,000 people. But when we started modeling, oh, sorry, and I should actually just define that there. So this area covers what we've said is well-connected residents. So well-connected is what we've defined as in the report as people who can readily access public transport. So how we've defined that is if they can use a bus or rail, one service to get into the urban core. And that bus has to run every 15 minutes. And also the rail service has to run every 30 minutes. And why we've done that is because if public transport is going to be a viable alternative to private transport, then we think it has to be reliable and it has to run often enough that people choose to make that choice. So when we started modeling, and this chart map here is on page 20, and it shows the impact, some of the modeling that we've done. So basically what we've looked at here is that, okay, if we could run the bus services that currently run more frequent and regularly at every 15 minutes, how far would that get us? But we've also said, okay, if we can integrate bus and rail together, how much further we would get. And just in case there's any questions of how we've modeled that, we've said, okay, if you're using rail to leave the Glasgow urban core, and then you stop at a station and then you get on a bus for the remainder of your journey, how far could you get? And I think it's just important to know when we've modeled that, we've also said there's a 5-minute gap just in between. So we recognize that it's not just a Doctor Who teleport between the train and the bus. We realize you're going to have to get off the train, probably barge a few people out of the way and click out the ticket barriers. So what we can see here, though, is that even though that Glasgow has a good coverage, that we can extend that to beyond into the wider region. And this is where we start seeing those gains. In terms of numbers, how have we quantified this? So like I said before, in the current state of the transport network, Glasgow actually covers about 900,000 people. What we're saying is if you were to increase frequencies, that actually you would add about 210,000 people. So those journeys which might be covered by an express service at the moment, and it might run maybe every hour or every half an hour, or actually doesn't run during peak hours, if we say, if those journeys were running, where would we get to? And actually it makes a considerable difference, and you can add 210,000, which is actually about a 25% increase on the number of people just by increasing the frequencies. And I think it's important to recognize that we're not talking about huge transport infrastructure changes here. We're talking about organizational changes that can make Glasgow run better. But also on top of that, when we started looking at rail integration, we see that we can add another 90,000 people. So overall, we're talking a difference here of about 300,000 people that we think we could make well connected into the Glasgow transport system. And that's about 1/3 of people we can add back into there, and also 1/3 of people that we try and convince that actually public transport can work and can be a viable alternative and provide them a good service. But we've also looked at setting new routes. And for this, we've looked at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. So this chart here is on page 21, if you can't see it from the back. And we're setting new routes. We could have looked at numerous different routes. I'm sure everyone has a wish list of routes. I mean, I would love to be able to get the cheap bus all the way across London, but that's certainly not possible. But if we look in terms of the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, we see that actually there's about 200,000 people at the moment who can access the hospital within 30 minutes. This is partly due to the fact that there's some industrial land around Queen Elizabeth, but also the fact is that the nearest rail stations are about a 20-minute walk, 20-minute walk from the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. So actually what we're saying is that if you were able to model new routes and actually provide new routes that could connect the hospital to surrounding areas, we say we could actually increase that to up to 350,000 people. And that's a 50% increase. And we've used a social asset here, not just because they're important, and also because residents had noted in their SPT regional transport survey that healthcare was something that they struggled to access. But also it shows that we're setting new routes can also have a big difference in reaching communities that are currently not connected with. We're also reaching economic hotspots, which can help drive Glasgow's performance. So I think what these graphs are showing us is that there's a considerable prize here, that Glasgow not only is underperforming, but also that there's actually a very large tangible residence base that we can connect across Glasgow, and it's worth doing so. And how we've thought about how to structure this and how policymakers should think about the changes that will come is that we thought of sort of a three-phase plan. And we know these changes don't come overnight and that they take time. We think in phase one that the SBT should lead on the bus franchising. And we think this is important because SBT currently exists and has the institutional capacity to do so, as it's already running some bus services and has control of the subway. But also, when you look at the local authority, and we've set this out in the report, that you see large volume of commuting between different local authority areas. So that's why we think it should be at the SPT level where the franchising occurs. But we also think that Scottish Government has a role to play. We've seen across the UK and in other European countries that central government will step in. I mean, across the UK, you can see through the city region transport settlements that the UK government has been actually more generous than usual in providing capital funding for transport projects. And you can see UK government has also supported Manchester in setting up a franchising. So we believe that actually Scottish government should put up front for a 10-year long investment deal that helps the region gets its transport network back into shape. And while this is happening, we think that in phase two, that local authorities, SPT and Scottish Government need to consider and agree actually how it's going to be funded and operated in the long term. Even if you take somewhere like London with TfL, while TfL is able to cover its commercial budget, it's not able to cover its capital budget. And we see this even in other European cities. If you look at Tallinn, while it has an income levy to support its transport network, it also requires a central government subsidy. So what we think is, while there are funding deals going on, the Scottish Government with SPT and local authorities need to decide, okay, how are we going to fund this? And in the report, we lay out some options around some of the powers that are currently used in the UK and elsewhere. That includes the income tax levy, also includes business rates, precepts, along with the council tax precepts, but also a workplace parking levy or congestion charge. And these are all things that, whatever the funding mix, the local authorities and SPT and Scottish Government decide upon, that they need to be considered. And from that, if any necessary government agreements are needed, i.e. who's going to collect the money, who's going to raise the money, or additional powers needed, then that should also be decided at this point. But in the longer term, in phase three, we think there's a real opportunity here to actually capitalize on what Glasgow has, what a lot of UK cities don't, and that's really that heavy rail network. And we think there's a real opportunity here for Glasgow to consider how it devolves its local rail services from ScotRail as part of the transport body that will run the network. And we think that's really important, not just because it helps with integration, and helps connect people into the wider labour market. We also think that's really important because it offers some chance of funding. We know that a lot of the land around stations could be used for residential purposes, so that increases density, but also they could be used for commercial purposes as well, whether it's advertising or any other pop-up shops you often see on these sort of places. So we think it's a real opportunity for Glasgow to actually be able to fund its franchise network in the longer term and actually make Glasgow a more prosperous place, and in the longer term, helping Scotland and an extension, the UK economy, reach its economic potential. So thank you very much for your time. You can explore the report on the website. And also, as I'm not there in person, as Ellie's already alluded to, and Andrew's COVID strike down, if there's any further questions, here's my email, but it's also on the first page of the report. So please do get in touch. And if there's any questions, like I say, we're always happy to answer.